Professor Timothy Noone, who is the senior editor of the critical edition of the Scotus Studies and professor at Catholic University and a prolific writer in Scotistic thought, Occam thought, and several of the Franciscan medievals. I had the privilege to study with him at Catholic U. And without further ado, I'm going to present Dr. Noone.
Thank you, Father. The title of my talk is Blessed Johns Duns Scotus on Intuitive Cognition, Abstractive Cognition, Scientific Knowledge, and Our Knowledge of God. Now, this talk and its successor tomorrow morning are conceived of as a pair. I'm going to deliberately start from the broad view and then focus in. We won't get a whole lot of materials immediately in this section that we can adroitly compare to Blessed John Cardinal Henry Newman, but we will as we near the end of this, and then the next paper that follows, you'll see there are tremendous numbers of parallels. I thought it was, however, better to start with this broad consideration because the authors, after all, are roughly 550 years apart. They use different languages. It's not readily apparent that what one means by a certain term is roughly what the other one means, and in some cases it isn't the same. And in other cases there are quite striking parallels. So lest we see parallels where there aren't, or lest we fail to note parallels where there are, I thought it was better to let everyone have a broader understanding of Scotus's thought, also because I think Scotus's terminology is more foreign to us, further removed from us certainly in time, and unless you have the penchant for reading scholastic philosophy on a daily basis, not to mention a nightly basis, like I do, you might be rather removed. And so I thought it probably was better to start with this broad consideration of Scotus and then work towards where the two men are tending or converging together. One of the many contributions of Duns Scotus to the history of philosophy is his formulation and application of the distinction between intuitive and abstractive intellectual cognition. Though our present inquiry will only take us partly towards our ultimate goal of understanding what Scotus means by intuitive cognition regarding intellectual knowledge and perceiving how he relates his psychological doctrine to his accounts of our knowledge of individual objects, our scientific knowledge, ordinary claims about general historical knowledge, and theological knowledge coming to us through tradition and the Scriptures, are indispensable conditions for any meaningful comparison between the two authors. Let us begin with the more ordinary and commonplace Aristotelian psychology, which Scotus inherits, and then proceeds to substantially qualify by adding his own teaching. Standard Aristotelian scholastic psychology. In Aristotelian psychology, intellectual knowledge is, generally speaking, distinguished fairly sharply from sense cognition through its being concerned with the universal. Mind, for Aristotle, and here I mean the historic Aristotle, knows the eidos, or natural type, of a given thing. Mind, in other words, knows dog. Mind, for Aristotle, does not know this dog. True, according to the Aristotelian teaching, all knowledge, including intellectual knowledge, begins in the senses, and in this regard begins with individual substances and their properties. But that is because sense cognition knows things first and as individual items or qualities prior to any intellectual knowledge, at least naturally prior. The process leading up to intellectual knowledge is a complicated one. But the senses, the five external senses which are so familiar to us, the internal senses of the sensus communis, the common sense as it's called by the medievals, that, by the way, is what allows us to have what later on will be called the unity of apperception, right? Memory, imagination, and sense judgment, or what Avicenna had called estimation, are all of them concerned with singulars in the classic Aristotelian picture. Intellectual knowledge takes its proximate starting point from an act of abstraction, produced by the active portion or part of the mind, known as the agent intellect, thereby allowing a universal intelligible form, not actually intelligible, but only potentially intelligible in the sense, to come to actualization and thereby inform the passive part of the mind, known traditionally as the possible intellect. Aristotle in the Greek says there's the intellect that makes all things. There is the intellect which is material and becomes all things. And this, of course, is going to cause a long controversy that we can adroitly work our way around without going into about what he means. This pre-conscious activity is what leads to an actual thought for Aristotle and explains why a thought is both universal and is about, nonetheless, a feature or a thing in the world. And that's, for Aristotle, that's what needs explained, because it's very unlikely, for example, that the people who are about to hear me say this word will have seen any of the things that I have seen that are called dog. It's extremely unlikely, right? So clearly, the term dog can't be like Tim Noone, assigned for just this individual, since, as I just said, none of you have seen the same dogs I have, but yet you understand when I say dog what that means. For Aristotle, that's a serious problem, and it wants an explanation. And a straightforward empiricist explanation is, he thinks, an ultimate failure, because you have to understand that the same types. And how's that possible? What's possible because there are universal intelligible elements in things, but they're not actually universal out there in the world. They're only potentially so. And this is where his doctrine comes from. Now, this is all fairly commonplace among the scholastic authors in the 13th century. But one further qualification needs to be introduced into the sketch before Scotus occupies our full attention. The external senses are activated by the immediate presence and concomitant causal impact on them of their external objects. By contrast, as many of Aristotle's commentators pointed out, a faculty such as the imagination, though a sense power, makes us aware of an object in its absence. Thinking about training a dog, right? When you finally get it to the point where it's just about ready to regularly scratch at the door to go do its business, and you've removed, hopefully, all the newspapers, and hopefully it's an outside door it's scratching at. The dog has an image of the newspaper. It's looking for the newspaper, can't find it. It's aware of the newspaper in its absence. And for Aristotle, that's imagination. And for all the medievals, that's imagination. They're aware of the sensible item in its absence. Which means, of course, that in effect, the term of its cognition is an image, right? It's not simply remembering the newspaper, it's actually looking for it. Right? This is a good example of what they mean by imagination in this precise sense. So it's aware of the sense awareness, notice, sense awareness of the object. We're not talking about the creative imagination, we're talking about the faculty that's common to us in the lower animals. So it's making us aware of the object in its absence. So too, for that matter, does another sense power memory, though it makes us, and the higher mammalia at least, aware of an object that was previously encountered in sense experience, and of that past experience. Sometimes scholastic authors, long before Scotus, spoke of the object of the imagination, and occasionally the object of the memory, as being abstract, or as gauged in the mode of abstract cognition. This terminology goes back to William of Auvergne. Because of this feature of making what was not immediately present to the senses to become an item of sense awareness nonetheless, even though it's not present. In other words, abstract cognition is a cognition that can go on in the presence or the absence of the item. This is the early terminology. This terminology of abstractive cognition needs to be kept quite distinct from the abstraction Aristotle speaks of when he talks about gaining the universal from the phantasm. For imagination is not an intellectual faculty for the scholastics. Now, for Scotus himself, there can be no doubt that Scotus inherited a tradition that used the Latin terminology, cognitio intuitiva, abstractive cognition, cognitio abstractiva, a tradition that largely, though not exclusively, was found among Franciscan authors, especially such figures as Matthew of Aquisparta and Vital de Four. Furthermore, the complaints of these late 13th century Franciscan psychologists, in my history courses I call these men the psychologists of the late 13th century, because there's a whole string of them. And it's clear they're all reading each other, and they have basically the same line of critique of the standard psychology we've just seen. They regard the limitation of intellectual knowledge to knowing universals only, characteristic, of course, of the standard Aristotelian psychology, as defective. And Scotus welcomes their observations. But if we really grasp what's essential and unique in Scotus's teaching, we should begin back at the senses, just as the Aristotelian standard psychology does. The point that I'm about to make is one that has received very little attention in recent literature on Scotus's theory of knowledge. In the last 15 years, to my knowledge, only 2 publications have taken note of it. One by Giorgio Pini, the more recent, and then Alain Delibera about roughly 15 years ago. Scotus's theory of sense knowledge does not at all agree with the standard Aristotelian picture. The senses for Scotus are only improperly or concomitantly aware of the singular. They are really aware of the common features of individual things. You will notice that I said common and not universal, because these terms are not equivalent in Duns Scotus. There's a very fine article on that by Olivier Benoit. For these two terms are not in Scotus's thinking interchangeable. An example of what he's talking about will make matters, I hope, a little clearer. Say I perceive a blue ball. What I see to start with one of the external senses is blue. But not this blueness in precisely its irrepeatable uniqueness. For if that was what it meant to say that the senses grasp the singular, then I would, of course, become immediately aware of what made this blue different from any other blue. And my sight of sense would exhaust itself, as it were, in just knowing this blue. Some different sense power would be needed to see that blue item, or at least that red item. And that's just contrary to fact for Scotus. What the sight sees is color. Any given color is what it perceives directly, and concomitantly it's aware of the individual item that has that color, but it doesn't grasp the individual precisely in its unique singularity. That's certainly not the case. So what it picks up on, in effect, is common, what is repeatable. And by the way, perceptive studies, modern psychology pretty well confirms this, because that's what we look for the pattern, right? Actually, that's how sight works, it's picking up on patterns. Scotus thinks instead that what the senses detect is what is common in the singular and what communicates itself to the sense and can be found in other things as well. In other words, although the item I perceive through the senses is to be sure a singular, none of my senses reach it in its radical singularity. I perceive what is singular, but not precisely as singular. And that's a very important distinction for him. Now, inasmuch as the senses furnish the starting point for all of our intellectual life, knowledge in the present life, the singular cannot be reached in its singularity through intellectual knowledge so grounded on sense knowledge. Things cannot give, after all, what they do not have, as Augustine would tell us. And if the senses themselves are not acquainted with the radical singularity of individual things, they cannot give our intellects the means of knowing those singulars in their radical singularities either. The knowability, or better, the intelligibility, of the singular, then, is one consideration behind Scotus's way of approaching intuitive intellectual cognition. But there is another, and in some ways a more important consideration. We see this in the efforts of earlier authors such as Vital Dufour and Matthew of Aquisparta, who pointed out the importance of knowing something through its existence, and how mere acquaintance with the relevant concepts and the formation of even a true judgment regarding the property of some type of thing would not be the same thing as knowing that there existed such an item with such a property. So to know that all mammalia, right, have complex nervous systems is not the same thing as knowing that there exists a mammal here and it has a complex nervous system. These are not interchangeable. The judgment of the existence of the thing. Furthermore, Matthew and other Franciscans had pointed out the unsuitability of holding the position, seemingly held in the standard Aristotelian psychology, that the senses knew the presence and existence of a thing, but the intellect, the higher cognitive power, lacked such an ability. Here, then, is another, perhaps more important reason for holding what Scotus does in reference to intuitive cognition on the part of the intellect, to allow for the intellect to know the actual presence and existence of an individual and the common features it has. Abstractive cognition for Scotus is a term that refers to any mode of awareness of a thing or feature of a thing that functions equally well in the presence or absence of the item. Given such a broad description of abstractive cognition, we may say that abstractive cognition is found in the cognitive activities of internal senses, such as the memory and the imagination, but in ordinary conceptual thinking as well. For when we are aware intellectually through concepts, we are thinking in such a way that the presence or absence of the item about which we're thinking is irrelevant. I can think of mammals. I can think of squares. I can right now think of rock formations in Nevada. I don't need their presence in order to be able to think about them. I can describe their crystalline structure perfectly well. Cause you to think about it if you know English. And so we can communicate and discuss crystalline structures. We don't have to be in their presence to do that, and we're not making the judgment there are crystalline structures here. We could make that judgment were we in the suitable environment, but it would be another mode of intellectual awareness for Scotus. Abstractive intellectual knowledge is the first kind of intellectual awareness in which we engage, since our intellects begin by abstracting intelligible features of sensibly perceived items, communicated in intellect through the image in the imagination, which is called by the medievals the phantasm, but not actually abstracted until the agent intellect exercises its function, co-causing the production of an intelligible species in the possible intellect. Such awareness is also what most often occupies our attention in theoretical inquiry and scientific discovery. Still, Scotus thinks that even in the present life, we enjoy a certain amount of intellectual intuitive cognition. This is the mode of intellectual cognition whereby we are aware of something in its existence and presence. In the position that he holds throughout his career, and I'm compressing a lot of stuff here, there's a literature that's enormous, actually, on intuitive and abstractive cognition, and I'm deliberately simplifying as much as I can without distorting, or at least distorting as little as I can. There's quite a literature on the different views Scotus held of intuitive cognition in his career. Scotus teaches throughout his career that we always have intellectual intuitive cognition of our so-called mental acts. That is, our own acts of thinking and willing, as well as our own acts of sense perception. Though we do not enjoy in the present life such cognitive access directly to things outside of the soul, at least in a certain respect. The importance of such an immediate, non-inferential intellectual cognition of our own acts is emphasized by Scotus in his questions on the knowledge of Christ in Book 3 of the Sentences. This is a text, by the way, from 3b that I transcribed only about a month and a half ago, so it's hot off the press, where he tells us that such indirect intellectual acquaintance with our own acts, their objects, and our remembering that we were the ones, you see, engaged in those acts, is crucial for our judgments of prudence and our efforts at moral reform. Quote, I make a further distinction regarding intuitive cognition, since it is either occurrent intuitive cognition of an existing object, or such knowledge lingering in the soul, from which the soul has intellectual memory, namely about an object previously grasped in experience. Otherwise, a human being would not provide for himself or others, and would fail to be prudent. Notice this. Intuitive cognition is key for an individual human being exercising prudence. Whence it is in the mode of intuitive cognition that I am aware that I am sitting, and through such cognition that a memory is formed whereby I remember that I was sitting. Otherwise, moreover, a human being would not repent of his own sins. This is a very straightforward matter for us, maybe commonsensically, but from Aristotelian psychological point of view, it's difficult to explain. Scotus, however, has no difficulty explaining it. See, it's not enough to know that some people tend to drink too much bourbon, or even that there's some given man in this room who might drink too much bourbon. I have to remember that it's Tim Noone who might, see, that is the point. That I am the agent who drank too much bourbon. You see, that without that, I'm not going to reform my conduct. So it's not enough to know simply the particular, what Aristotelian would call the particular, some human being, right? But to know that I am that human being. And for him, this can't be arrived at by inference. I have to be immediately aware of that I'm the agent in question. And that's what he means when he says, otherwise you wouldn't repent of your sins. Because Scotus, as has already been mentioned, has such numerous reservations regarding the extent to which our intuitive cognition is operative, at least in the ordinary human being in the present life, we must examine Christic psychology to see both abstractive and intuitive cognition functioning at their fullness. And this is, I think, the way to go into the material, because then you see what perfect intellectual cognition, both abstractive and intuitive, would look like. Just a side comment. From a philosopher's standpoint, this is going to seem like a very strange comment, but I think this is true. From a philosopher's standpoint, what would have been most interesting would be if Duns Scotus had written on the cognitive states of Our Lady. Because where this text is coming from is when he gets to the third question and he's talking about only the natural knowledge of Christ. But of course, that's because in the case of Christ, he has to make sure you understand he's not talking about Christ's knowledge of the Word, because you've got the hypostatic union. So actually, Our Lady would be the perfect epistemic case for Scotus. But unfortunately, we don't have such a treatise. So I'm tantalizing the philosophers here. This is an interesting case. So we have to look at Christic knowledge, and we have to infer extend it by inference. All right. Abstractive cognition is the type of intellectual awareness that prescinds from the order of time, targeting solely the essences of the things known. As such, abstractive cognition may be concerned with either natures, whether generic or specific, or singulars in their singularity. As you can have abstractive awareness of a singular for Duns Scotus. Intuitive cognition is a type of intellectual cognition that directly concerns either natures or individuals as existing. Notice that you can be intuitively aware of kinds for Duns Scotus. That is, if I had intuitive cognition of Father Peter here as an external object, I would know his thisness, and I'd know all the natures that go into his ontological constitution. And I would know that they were in him, as existing. This is what he's talking about, going on with Christ. As Scotus expresses the point, acquaintance with the terms of a contingent proposition, such as Peter is sitting, cannot yield the knowledge of the truth or the falsity of that proposition, in marked contrast to an abstractly known necessary proposition, such as every whole is greater than its parts, or all mammals have complex nervous systems, or something like that, whose truth can be known without acquaintance with whether those things actually exist. What this means for Christ's knowledge is that if we set aside knowledge through the Word, which pre-contains all things, Christ could only know the contingent truth of a proposition, such as one bearing his own crucifixion, in the presence of the actual events. The mechanics of Christ's cognition, moreover, are determined in general by Scotus's wish to attribute as perfect a mode of cognition to him as would be consistent with his creaturely human nature. Such a manner of cognition involves, Scotus thinks, one parallel with, though distinct from, the one found in the natural cognition of the angels. The angels, in Scotus's view, have innate or naturally infused intelligible species supplied by God that allow them to know things, though their thinking involves discursive reasoning, and they naturally have possible and agent intellects as well that function in regard to knowing individuals. Likewise, Scotus holds that Christ's mind, endowed though it is with agent and possible intellects, has naturally implanted within it species that are equivalent to what the agent and possible intellect would produce. All of this Christological speculation about the principled limits of human psychology has the following to teach us about Scotus's approach. We may have in principle, and Christ does in fact have, either abstract awareness of either natures or individuals, that is, awareness that prescinds from the order of time and existence and remains true independent of what actual things actually exist here and now and the natures that they instantiate. Furthermore, we may have in principle, and Christ doesn't have in fact, intuitive cognition, that is, awareness of the actual individuals that encompass knowing their existence and presence, both in terms of their natures and in terms of themselves as individuals, including their thisness, their unique property. We see that this is quite clearly the case in a remarkably succinct summary given by Scotus at the end of a key question of his Ordinatio, in which he treats the manner in which Christ learned or progressed in his intellectual knowledge. Quote, "So too, when a sensible item is present to a sense power, two kinds of cognition can be caused through the power of that sensible experience. One is an abstractive cognition, whereby the agent intellect abstracts the species of a quiddity or essence from the species in the phantasm, which, i.e. the species of the quiddity, represents its object absolutely, and not as it exists now and then. The other that can occur is an intuitive cognition in the intellect, whereby the object cooperates with the mind inasmuch as the object exists. And from this second type of cognition, a habitual intuitive cognition can linger, brought to pass in the intellectual memory. This type of cognition is not of the quiddity absolutely understood, as was the first and abstractive cognition, but rather of the thing known as existing, namely, in the manner the thing was apprehended as existing in the past. In this way, Christ is claimed to have learned many things through experience, that is, through intuitive cognitions, that is to say, of those things known in terms of their existence, and through the memories left behind from those intuitive cognitions." Unquote. So this is Scotus's effort to let you know what intuitive cognitions and abstractive cognition at their zenith mean, but also, of course, in the case of Christ, to explain precisely how it was that Christ learned things. And of course, for him, Christ learns mainly only things in the order of intuitive cognition, proceeding from acts of memory and things like that. Now, I turn to scientific knowledge. Regarding scientific knowledge, Scotus's teaching is much more in line with standard scholastic views, though his own outlook tends to be more strict than what is seen in some writers. The notion of scientia, or scientific knowledge, needs in the first place a comment. In modern English, at least, we tend to think of the physical sciences, such as physics, chemistry, or biology, if someone remarks that a student is studying science. Even the other inquiries that on face value seem to be quite different, disciplines such as anthropology, sociology, and psychology, aspire to be social sciences by modeling themselves upon empirical and mathematically measurable experiments that result in positive knowledge. To the extent that we tend to think of such positive knowledge based on empirical investigation, usually with mathematical manipulation, whenever we hear the term science, we are remote from what the medieval philosophers meant by science. For them, science meant an organized body of teaching and learning that concerned or bore upon one subject matter. And hence, for them, mathematics, grammar, logic, geometry, and physics were all sciences. Their model for science was largely indebted to Aristotle's posterior analytics, a rather difficult work, in which Aristotle lays down his canons of epistemology. The examples of scientific knowledge are usually taken by Aristotle from geometry, astronomy, and physics, but most frequently geometry. In the case of geometry, there's a clear subject, figure, which has its constituent elements, line and point, its axioms or presuppositions connected to its subject, and the conclusions that clearly follow from the axioms when the latter are applied to specific types of figures, such as triangles or circles. Generally considered, Scotus's appropriation of this Aristotelian teaching emphasizes, first, that the starting points of science in the most complete sense are necessary. Second, that the key feature of such knowledge is the evidence it provides to the intellect. Third, that the intellect must assent to the propositions that are evident to it, whether these propositions are self-evident or mediated by syllogistic deduction. And fourth, that sciences, properly so called, are formally unified branches of knowledge by reasoning commencing from self-evident propositions and terminating in demonstrated conclusions. Professor Stephen Maroney has expressed the point well by saying that, according to Duns Scotus, quote, science that truly aspired to being the best knowledge of all had to worry only about attaining certitude and producing evidence upon which it could rest, unquote. Scotus himself gives us several overviews of his teaching on scientific knowledge in the strict sense, but the one most pertinent to our queries comes at a convenient spot in the midst of his treatment of the issue of whether there can coexist in the same mind at the same time both faith and reason. Here Scotus summarizes his views as follows. Quote, but if we understand science properly, as it's understood in the Posterior Analytics Book 1, 4 conditions are needed in the following way in science. First, it must be certain knowledge, excluding any doubt or deception. The second condition is that it must be about a necessary object known. Third, it must be through a cause evident to the intellect. Fourth, it must be a necessary cause, evidently applying the principles to the conclusion through discursive reasoning. And understanding science in this way, it is impossible for there to be science and faith about the self-same thing, unquote. So much for knowledge in the strictest sense in terms of its formal structure. A final point to be made before leaving this topic altogether is Scotus's underlying reasons for holding that the intellect, when presented with clear evidence, must assent to the truth of self-evident propositions or the syllogistic reasoning based upon such propositions. For Scotus, intellect taken in its own right is a natural cause or principle as opposed to the will. Will and agents endowed with will may or may not act, since the activity of the will lies in the power of the voluntary agent. Natural agents and causes, by contrast, must act, and to the utmost of their power, once the proper conditions for their proper activity are realized. As a natural power, the intellect too has to act, that is, to assent, to propositions that are evident to it, to the extent that they are so. Now, I've got a section on the knowledge of God, which I'm going to go through first to let you know how he views, if you want, the strictest knowledge we have of God, and then we're going to working our way towards the informal knowledge of God, which is going to be occupying my attention in the next lecture. In approaching our knowledge of God, we come to a topic that intensely concerned Duns Scotus, along with most scholastic philosophers and theologians. The theme of the knowledge of God, however, may have concerned Scotus more than most of his fellow scholastics, because he held theses that made it necessary for him to explain, more clearly than his predecessors and contemporaries, why natural knowledge of God would not suffice for human fulfillment and happiness, since he believed that we can have knowledge of God's essence, and that this was obtained, at least in part, through the notion of being gotten from creatures. Like most of his contemporaries, he divides our knowledge of God into 2 types, natural and supernatural. The former is found in its highest form in the philosophical science of metaphysics, a study concerned with being as being. The latter is given to us through revelation, communicated through Scripture in the living tradition of the Church. The latter topic, knowledge of God through revelation, leads to a discussion of whether theology, or the systematic study of the revealed data, merits the term of science in the sense we saw above. But in addition to his treatments of the 2 more formal ways in which we know God, Scotus discusses at unusual length for a medieval theologian the topics of acquired faith as opposed to infused faith, and the reasonability of Christian revelation in particular. The last topics will be broached in the present lecture but more thoroughly explored with an eye to points of comparison to Newman in the succeeding lecture. To ensure that we have the broader picture in view, I would like to offer a sketch of Scotus's account of our formal knowledge of God, both natural and supernatural. Natural knowledge of God is acquired in the science of metaphysics. Following the mainstream 13th century tradition, Scotus holds that God falls under the subject of the science through the concept of infinite being. What distinguishes Scotus's position from such figures as Robert Kilwardby and Albert the Great is that he argues that the notion of being acquired from creatures applies univocally to God and creatures. If I could break from my prepared remarks, I have to explain this at great length because of the accusation of ontotheology. It's a habit. I have to do this about once a semester. It is commonplace teaching in the 13th century. Robert Kilwardby, Dominican, Cesar Brabant, arts master, Paris, Albert the Great, Dominican, all think that God in some way falls under or fits under the subject matter of metaphysics. That's the commonplace position. The uncommonplace position is that of Thomas Aquinas. He's the odd man out. In fact, you get nothing like Thomas until Thomas. And then, of course, after that, you get people. So his is the uncommon position. So if saying God falls under the subject matter of metaphysics counts as ontotheology, then the vast majority of the tradition has been ontotheological to the core. So I always get into arguments about this. So the unusual thing isn't the claim, contrary to certain people writing in England nowadays. The unusual thing in him is not the claim that God falls under the subject matter of metaphysics. The unusual thing is to hold that the concept of being that we get from creatures can be univocally applied to God. That's the unusual thing. The rest of it is pretty standard stuff. The tradition behind this, by the way, goes back to Avicenna. He's the ultimate author of this tradition. Okay, so the doctrine of the universality of being is, at one and the same time, the earmark and the badge, I wear it proudly, of Scotism. It has been frequently reviled as the catalyst for the decline of scholastic thought. Rightly understood, however, the doctrine seems no threat to traditional thinking, but rather the articulation of the underlying epistemic conditions for any positive knowledge of God through natural reason. For Scotus's doctrine of univocity amounts to the following modest claims. First, that the notion of being we acquire through acquaintance with creatures has a core meaning that lets us talk of God as a being, albeit the precise notion of God is infinite being. Second, that the core meaning regarding being extends to being's attributes and perfections, so that, for example, when we say God is infinite truth, the term truth, like being, has a meaning such that to say God is truth and to deny that God is truth is to state a contradiction. That's all univocity means. It goes through this several times. Univocity just means this, that to say X and not X of the self-same thing involves a contradiction. That's all it's involved. It doesn't have anything to do with being in a species. It doesn't have anything to do with being in a genus, etc. The reason I have to go over this is that that's a contrasting position in St. Thomas. St. Thomas thinks that really univocal predication only goes on inside a species. And then you get to the genus, and there's already a kind of fuzziness. And when you get to anything beyond the genus, then for sure we're going to have some kind of equivocation or analogy going on, whereas Scotus has a very thin notion of univocity. Now, if we consider Scotus's arguments for God's existence, probably the most elaborate effort at proving God's existence ever produced in medieval philosophy, I think Thomas Merton once remarked it was the most elaborate proof that was ever worked out by the human mind, and there are times I think that might be correct. We seem, on the strength of Scotus's theory of univocity, to be committed to saying that we can and do have knowledge of what God is, namely infinite being, infinite unity, infinite truth, infinite goodness, and all the other pure perfections, such as love, knowledge, and will, in an infinite degree. To the extent, moreover, that we would identify positively what God is with his essence, we may say that Scotus's approach to our natural knowledge of God entails that we know, to some extent, the divine essence. This may strike us, as it did some of Scotus's students, as undermining the need for supernatural or revealed knowledge of God. But Scotus invokes here his own teaching regarding knowledge through intuitive and abstractive cognition. However great our knowledge of God through the concept of infinite being, such knowledge remains mediated knowledge. That is, knowledge through a cognitive intermediary, a concept, and knowledge that holds good independent of the presence of the thing. Hence, even in the most refined conceptual analysis of God, or the most lofty philosophical contemplation of the divine nature, We are dealing with abstractive awareness, awareness that thinks of God as an object and does not enjoy the divine presence in the manner of the beatific vision. It is not, as Scotus tells us repeatedly, knowing God, and I apologize, but this is what it says in Latin, knowing God as a this. He's dealing with the objection. He says, you know God, and you know what God is, but you don't know God as a this. To put it most broadly, for Duns Scotus, it's not, our knowledge of God now is fuzzy and imperfect, not because our concepts are somehow malarranged, malformed, bad, but because we don't know the divine presence. We're not aware of God as a present and existent object. To know God as a this would involve God's gracious self-disclosure to us, communicated to us through revelation, but only enjoyed fully in the beatific vision. Supernatural knowledge of God comes from Scripture for Scotus and the teaching of the Church, including conciliar decrees, patristic writings, and papal pronouncements. Such teaching was believed by many 13th century authors to meet the criterion for scientific knowledge laid down by Aristotle. On this point, Scotus takes the position that theology in the present state is a practical science, inasmuch as it fits the broad description of a knowledge that would confirm to praxis and would govern praxis. In terms of the four conditions of science, furthermore, theology taken in itself, apart from human beings, could be found in God insofar as he could know theology without engaging in discursive reasoning. The blessed can know theology too, but their knowledge will involve the quasi-discursive sequencing of what is logically prior and logically posterior. Our own actual theology is thus practical, but only imperfectly science, insofar as its starting points are not evident to us through the terms of the propositions, but are accepted on the authority of the Church and faith in the Scriptures. Still, as Professor Stephen Dumont showed some 20 years ago, Scotus wanted to allow in his Parisian prologue for the possibility that God could give us, if he wished, a species or representative proxy that would allow us to know theology in a higher way, rather analogous to the way that the angels have a distinct, though abstract, awareness of God through a species. Were we to be endowed through God's will with such a starting point, theology would become a higher level of science, one close to what Scotus's predecessor, Henry of Ghent, held to be attained through a special light, the famous lumen medium in the case of theologians. Yet even in such circumstances, this rigorous knowledge of God that we could in principle have would remain abstract awareness of God, not intuitive. Having covered Scotus's formal treatments of our knowledge of God and the distinction between intuitive and abstractive cognition, we have the bulk of our work still before us, I regret to report. For it is a key feature of Scotus's treatment of our knowledge of God to relate our ordinary informal awareness of God to our everyday beliefs and judgments, and to argue in this regard for the reasonableness of Christian faith and belief. This feature of Scotus's works, though unusual in reference to the common scholastic pattern, has its origin, at least I think in terms of inspiration, in the writings of Matthew of Aquisparta. Matthew spends considerable time in his Questiones de Fide, disputed at the end of the 1270s, beginning of the 1280s in Paris, arguing that any strict modeling of inferences governing everyday life upon the model of science found in the posture analytics is highly problematical for explaining everyday reasoning and belief. As Matthew goes on ad nauseam to point out, if you had to rely on demonstration, you couldn't believe that your wife was your wife, you couldn't believe that the contract was going to hold up, you couldn't believe all kinds of everyday things that are perfectly reasonable to believe. And I think there's no doubt, when you compare the Questiones de Fide of Matthew with the prologue of Scotus, and for that matter, this section we're going to look at, distinction 23, 24, and 25 of Book 3, there's no doubt in my mind that he had Matthew in part in mind as he wrote those materials. So, this matter had been broached earlier than Scotus. I just think he has a very systematic way of accounting for this kind of knowledge within the scope of, nonetheless, endorsing there being real science. Scotus's distinction between science in the strict sense, which we've been today examining, and a broader, though less demanding notion of knowledge, is tailored to fit everyday inferences and historical knowledge in particular. Study of this looser notion of science or knowledge, together with Scotus's treatment of faith, both acquired and infused, will occupy our attention in the next lecture.
Thank you, Professor Noone. You said so modestly that so much has been written about intuitive and abstractive cognition. Mm-hmm. So what you have done for us here is truly to prepare the way not only for your next presentation tomorrow, but you have prepared it for the presentation that Father Peter Damian Fellner is going to be giving us Okay. This is so central. And I think we can put it in this way. I think it's not an unfair statement to say that Newman puts Scotus into modern English. And I'll carry that a little bit further. Intuitive and abstractive cognition is so important that when Newman speaks in the Grammar of Assent about notional and real apprehension and notional and real assent, he's putting Scotus into modern English. Okay, that's just it's a very broad statement, but it's a kind of a statement that Father Ford would pick up on, Father Fellner would pick on, and I think myself, working with all of you. I'm convinced of this as I get older, and the light is shining a bit more. That light is not so bright that I can't see what it's illuminating. Yeah. This is just a brief comment, and now we're going to open this up to our audience. Please.
I think they want you to use the microphone for the sake of the television audience. Yeah.
Thank you, Father. Thank you very much. Let me see if I may have grasped what you said, and you can correct me on my understanding as we go through this. And this is referring to what you said towards the end, for it is a key feature of Scotus's treatment of our knowledge of God to relate our ordinary informal awareness of God to our everyday beliefs and judgments, and then to argue in this regard for the reasonableness of Christian faith and belief.
Right.
Now, trying to work with categories here, let me see if I think I understand that. For example, in our everyday beliefs and judgments, such as our experience of interpersonal relationships and what is involved in that, to relate that, and that is as I understand it, what you mean by abstractive knowledge, that experiential knowledge that we have.
Abstract knowledge for him, you're talking about scientific knowledge, or what?
Well, I'm talking about knowledge that we would get from interpersonal interactions.
It'd be a combination of intuitive and abstractive.
Now, if we relate that, or perhaps analogize that to our knowledge of God, which is not experiential as it is in the in the form of the experience with others.
Right.
That is a ground from which to argue for the reasonableness of Christian faith.
That's correct. Although he will tend to argue this way, that because he's pretty strict when he begins, right? The idea is, look, I can't demonstrate there's a place called Rome. I mean, for all I know, it fell apart. I mean, Father didn't come from there, so I have no right now. But I believe, and it's completely reasonable to believe, there's a place called Rome. I've never been to Ankara, but I think it's completely reasonable to believe there's a place called Ankara, right? So, and this is exactly like Newman will argue about England is an island, right? This is where this is beginning, right? It's completely, but it's underdetermined, right? In other words, it's not like every mammal has a complex nervous system. I have direct evidence for that in the order of abstract. I can deduce that from certain properties, right? Nothing could count as a mammal unless it had a complex nervous system, right? That's what, if I go down to the science department at Catholic U, that's what they're going to start telling me, right? Okay. If I find an entity that doesn't have a complex nervous system, they're going to tell me that you haven't found a mammal. You found maybe some other kind of animal, but it's not a mammal. So for Scotus, it's completely reasonable, and I think Newman too, to believe propositions that you have to trust others, right? And this is the interpersonal element. And they tell you X is the case, right? It's completely reasonable, and it would be unreasonable to say, nope, there can't be any anchor. It hasn't been shown to me scientifically. Oh, no anchor. That would be unreasonable. Okay. So, and there's exact parallel on that point. Yeah, that's what Scotus thinks, is that we can begin, and he call this. It's very interesting. He in the section we're going to go through tomorrow, he calls this science, scientia, right? He also calls it acquired faith, natural acquired faith, of course, from a theological standpoint. And that's completely reasonable. And then he argues that that's analogous to the case of Christian beliefs about, say, the Trinity or the Incarnation, whichever revealed datum you want to consider. So, yeah.
So
This is very unusual for a scholastic author. You don't usually get this. Before him, the only person I know who got in much detail in this regard was Matthew, at least among the famous theologians.
So we can argue from actual experience and the evidence we receive from that to the possibility of experience.
That's right. That's right. Or in some cases, graced persons, of course. Right. I mean, you have to allow for St. Francis and St. Paul, and they are concerned with those as professional theologians. Those cases of exceptional knowledge, of course, as well. But you're quite right to think that that's what's going on. That's right. And you'll see tomorrow how this fits in, and that's why he insists on this category of knowledge in a looser sense than the strict demonstrative knowledge, that nonetheless is what we use regarding forming reasonable beliefs about everyday items. He also points out it's what we use when we have to make judgments about historical matters, believing historical accounts, and it's also what we use, he thinks, the same model of reason we use when applied to matters of believability of Christianity, for example.
All right. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Yes, Alex, doctoral student from St. Louis University.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you very much for the presentation. That was very interesting.
Thank you.
I have just a couple of clarification questions. I'll just ask one to begin with. The answer might be really quick. On page 4, when you say that Scotus teaches that we always have intellectual intuitive cognition of our own so-called mental acts.
Right.
Does he? And then you go on. You say, I'm wondering if that. We have knowledge of our own mental acts, but do we also have knowledge of the soul itself?
Only as an underlying subject, not the essence of the soul.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's
that
right.
was my first question.
Yeah, that's
All
right. That's right. Yeah. In fact, if we had perfectly perspicacious, intuitive knowledge of our own faith habit, we could look inside, right, and we could know whether we had infused or acquired faith. A proposition he explicitly argues against. Whereas I can't look in my soul and say, oh, I've got in there infused faith, and infused faith is true, so I can see now all the theological truths that are in that faith. Is right. Yeah, so no.
So he doesn't even say that we have a partial knowledge or something like that.
We do have our total knowledge of our acts.
Of our soul.
Yeah, but we can't know all our habits.
So inferentially,
perspicaciously.
so by inference we know that there's a soul having acts, but we don't know any of the essential properties of the soul.
We're aware that there being a soul having acts. That's right, and but that's all we're aware of. We don't know all the habits that inform us. We can't. Right? You don't do psychology just looking inside your soul. And the reason I have so-called mental acts, I'm being a little precious there, because I have to use English terminology to get this into English. But in English terminology, so heavily influenced by Descartes, my perceiving you right now through my eyes is itself a mental act for Descartes. Right? That's why I put so-called in there, because the scholastics would fuss over this. Right, the scholastics wouldn't like this because they would want to say that there are properly mental acts and there are properly sense acts. Right? Now, for Duns Scotus, to be sure, my intuitive cognition, because it is part of my intellectual soul, which is the form of myself as an individual human being, my intellectual intuitive cognition would be aware of my concomitant sense acts, sure. But those sense acts would not be directly intellectual. Right? Those sense acts would probably be right, have to do with the sensitive part of the soul, right? Which is for them, of course, this is just the point that Descartes would deny. So that's why I call it so-called. I don't want to attribute to Duns Scotus the Cartesian distinction, right, or rather the Cartesian lack of distinction in this case. Yeah. The so-called mentalizing, of sense acts by Descartes would not receive a warm welcome from Duns Scotus had he lived another 400 years. Yeah.
Thanks.
Sorry, that's what that's about. I don't want to give people the wrong impression that he's a pre-Cartesian Cartesian. Right? But in English, we tend to use, for better or for worse, this. I don't think people are aware of it when they say mental acts, because they'll just start talking about sense acts or even acts of imagination, right? And they think they're all mental acts. Well, they don't know it, but that's purely Cartesian. No one before Descartes and before the 17th century would have understood what you're talking about. You're talking about when you asked a Scholastic or St. Augustine about a mental act, he would think it was primarily acts of will and intellect, right? And then sense acts would be sense acts. Now, the mind might be aware of those sense acts, but that's, right, if you want indirect cognition.
I'd like to ask a brief question about your reference you made to Stephen Dumont and that classic article he wrote in Speculum in 1989 on intuitive and abstractive cognition. Stephen, I know, was an important person in your own life. I know when you were doing doctoral work, he was there helping you out a bit at the beginning. And the question I have is, when he writes that article, and you didn't go into detail, but I think for the benefit of the audience, I'm trying to make a broad connection here, is in that article, he doesn't mention much about how Scotus may have been influenced by the thought of Bonaventure. I think there's an absence, and that's an absolutely excellent artitle. Mm-hmm. Do you care to comment on that? Because you have an expertise in both areas.
Yeah, I just in the last year, I was blessed to be asked to give the Gilson lecture last March of this calendar year. And as I was doing the research for that, it became very clear to me that if you don't pay attention to the word intuitive cognition, but you pay attention to the idea, that is, its awareness of the existence and presence of the thing, the first scholastic that I'm aware of to attribute this mode of cognition to a finite cognitive agent is St. Bonaventure. And he uses exactly this in his discussion of the angels. This point, what he meant, by the way, was missed at least by two very famous men, Thomas Aquinas and Robert Kilwerby. Neither one of them understood what he was talking about. Because he says three times, sine species, without a species. And they, of course, because he talks about it as a way of seeing, but of course, in the scholastic understanding of seeing, what goes on is that an image comes in, let's try like the modern theory, right? An image comes in, they had read Alhazen, and they knew about it being reversed in the back of the brain. They knew about that because Alhazen told them about that. And so this image, right? So obviously, in ordinary physical seeing, there's always a species for them, right? So because he uses, but even though he says sine species, they all understood it according to the then current model of physical vision. And of course, that meant for Thomas Aquinas that Bonaventure must have meant there was a species of the singular, right? And to be fair, I don't think he was the only person in the tradition misunderstanding. I think Matthew of Aquisparta also misunderstood this point, because Matthew of Aquisparta too will talk about the species of the individual thing being received this way. But no, I mean, it's pretty clear when you get, because Bonaventure's point is that the way that the angels attain certitude regarding an individual is by combining and recombining those type forms, those intelligible species which are universal, to suit the individual, but their acquaintance with the individual is not by species, by knowing it in its immediate presence and existence, he says 3 times. And there's no doubt in my mind, because I just went through the questions on the angels in Duns Scotus' Parisian report, he has those questions in mind. So, yeah, this is something that Stephen wouldn't have known. I just sent him my Gilson lecture just a couple weeks ago electronically. I haven't heard his feedback yet. But I mean, but mind you, in that article, which I think is classic, what he's out to show is that what's in one way innovative about Scotus is the way he gets very precise about abstractive cognition. I'm very persuaded of that. In other words, until you get abstractive cognition really down pat in Scotus, you don't really quite understand what the role is of an intuitive cognition.
But you see why my question, because what it does, it shows there's a connection between Bonaventure's thought, Scotus, and we're going to argue the connection with Newman.
Right.
And that brings us to the time to break now after this second lecture. We take a short break now, and then we come back to listen to Father Peter Damian Fellner speak to us about Scotus and Newman in dialogue. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.